And that concludes questions for oral answer. I call on Government Order of the point of order, Ms Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, an urgent question was lodged with you prior to question time, and I believe that now is the time when you make a ruling on whether in fact the urgent question will be allowed.
Again, the member needs to study standing orders and Speaker's rulings and McGee. An urgent question is a decision that I make. I then have a duty to advise the member who wished to ask the urgent question, and I have a duty to advise the Minister. I don't normally make such an announcement in the House, but for guidance for the future with urgent questions, the issue that I consider is whether that question has to be asked today, whether it is a matter of such importance that it won't wait till next week. In this particular case, I did not consider it met that test. I call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
Health and Safety Reform Bill, committee stage continued.
I declare the House in committee for further consideration of the Health and Safety Reform Bill. Mr Chairman.
David.
Yeah, we can't put it staff member.
They did have the vote, didn't they, last night?
Yeah, they did have the vote.
Okay, so I can just declare...
Here's James.
Truck the other side of the speaker, sorry. My name is Mr Chairman.
Thank you. Members, the House is in committee for further consideration of the Health and Safety Reform Bill. Members, when we were last considering this bill, we were debating Part 3. The question is that Part 3 stand part. I call the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Chairman, and we come now to Part 3 of the bill, which has to be the heart of the failure of the bill. Mr Speaker, it's the crucial area in which the Labor Party, who have supported the bill into Select Committee, now is firmly separated from the government, Mr Speaker. The Minister, in earlier debate in the House, has pointed to the fact that 75% of the people working in New Zealand will be covered by all parts of the bill. But the 25% who won't be are the people who we are considering here, Mr Speaker. In Subpart 2, I'll focus on this part of it, Subpart 2 of Part 3, Mr Speaker, the clause 65.3, no health and safety reps at PCBUs with fewer than 20 workers. Well, Mr Speaker, New Zealand has prided itself in being a country of small and medium enterprises, in fact, with most of them being in the small side. That is below 20 employees. And in fact, in the area of my interest and responsibility, primary industries, Mr Speaker, the vast majority of people are in this bracket, Mr Speaker. And indeed, if you look at the statistics, where most of the people unfortunately lose their lives or are seriously injured, then most of them would be working in the small to medium enterprises in the primary sector and in the area that the government is failing to implement proper recommendations and protections, Mr Speaker. And the question comes from, there will be farmers out there who say, this is wonderful, we've been exempted from this part of it and we can get on with our business, Mr Speaker. Until, of course, the occasion arises where we have a death or serious injury, which all too often happens on a weekly, if not daily basis, if we talk about injuries, Mr Speaker, across the primary sectors. These are the people who this bill must protect. Because, as I said earlier in this House, most legislation we pass is actually to protect a minority of people who need protection for themselves or from others or whatever, because the vast majority of people, and this runs right through business, right through society, Mr Speaker, and communities, the vast majority of people, through good luck or good management, can protect themselves or protect others from themselves or whatever. But we are dealing with legislation here that must be strong, must be focused to deal with the people who, through human nature or commercial greed or just plain ignorance, are not going to do the right thing. Mr. Speaker, I could quote you hundreds of occasions in my experience as a contract fencer, as a farmer, as a share milker, as a tourism operator, as someone who has worked personally in what I would consider are all high-risk areas, although the government and its officials don't consider. Dairy industry is apparently not high risk, sheep farming is not high risk, but mini golf is. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I know they are high risk, and I say to farmers to provoke and promote honest conversation when it comes to things like insurance and it comes to things like our practices on farm. We are in a high-risk environment doing high-risk things, Mr. Speaker, with animals, with bikes, at the far away from any point of contact. Good farms now might have radio systems, they might have cell phones, but there are huge numbers of people in the rural and primary sectors who have no communication where they work often, are working with animals that are unpredictable. If people in here know and work with animals, most of them are unpredictable. If you've got some experience, you might be able to herd them and you might have some idea of where they go, but you can be guaranteed that in the end they are unpredictable, and the chances are that unless you've put in place protections and seen ahead or foreseen that unpredictability, you're at risk. You're at high risk because when an incident occurs, there are often not lots of other people around you, particularly if you work in a small enterprise, that is one of under 20 employees. The very classification that this government is exempting, Mr. Speaker, from the same provisions that should be in place for those over 20. Why should those employees have, Mr. Chairman?
The Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Why should those employees have lesser standards of protection than those working in a workplace of over 20 employees? It is immoral, unethical, unfair. Call it what you like, but just because you work in an environment of less than 20 employees, fewer. My English is not perfect. Mr. Chairman, fewer than 20 employees, why should you have less protection? And the issue for farmers, what does this mean in practice? Well, it might mean that, well, it should mean that one of the employees on that farm, and there may only be one or two or three, should have some training, should have some advice on what is good, safe practice in a farming environment. Now, they may know. There's no guarantee of that at all. Because if you're working in an environment over 20 employees, Mr. Speaker, someone would be appointed or elected, and someone would have the responsibility of upskilling themselves with the support of the company, we hope, to go and learn. No, they all do. Oh, yes. Well, that member should go back and read the debates, Mr. Speaker, of 1992. And I've heard it said from members on the other side of the House, we must improve the culture. They imply that the culture among employees is not up to standard. Well, there should be a greater level of awareness, I accept that, but awareness comes from education. And if someone is employed and not given the opportunity to be educated, and there are some of them here, Mr. Speaker, the one particular visitor from the UK who came over was given a motorbike on an orchard without any education and was killed in the first day of work, Mr. Speaker. That is the kind of situation that we're trying to keep ahead of. So the culture that the cynical MPs on that side sneer about, implying that workers don't understand safety and they've got to upskill themselves. Mr. Speaker, the harsh reality is that commercial pressure from employers or from people who are employed, foremen or whatever, to get more for less, and indeed that's a good business practice, I guess. Efficiency it's often called, but if it's done so at the expense of the standards of health and safety, that is where we see accidents occurring, Mr. Speaker, and it happens too often. We're in fact implementing a piece of legislation to try and keep ahead of human nature. We are a very innovative nation. We are number 8 wire, we call it, and we pride ourselves of being able to do things that no one else thought of. And that's great, but over the years, we've cut corners to do that. And over the years, hundreds and thousands of workers in this country have lost their lives. I have 2 cousins from one family. They both lost their lives in the workplace for things that you might sit back and say, that was silly, that was stupid. But without proper provisions, indeed that cover every part of every workplace, people in New Zealand will, taking their number 8 mentality, they will cut corners. And what we are doing in the passage of this legislation is that we're trying to put in place protection for themselves and for others. Mr. Speaker, Part 3 divides the workers of New Zealand into those who are perhaps lucky enough to work in a large environment, a large workplace of over 20 employees, and others, particularly in the primary sector, who won't have that same level of protection. Now, the member over there says, oh, it's in the legislation.
Rubbish.
What we do not have is on-ground active management from an individual in that small workplace who has both upskilled, trained, and is given some responsibility to try and remind their fellow workers and themselves of what should be the best practice. Because if you don't do that, then we as Kiwis will cut the corners. And we as Kiwis have died in our hundreds because of that.
Mr. Hipkins.
Mr. Chairman.